Welcome back. The focus of this lesson is cookies. Sadly, not the tasty kind, but a useful function of a web browser. According to the syllabus, you should be able to explain what is meant by cookies and how they're used, including session cookies and persistent cookies. So we're going to start the lesson by focusing on what exactly a cookie is. A very simple explanation is that it is a small text file that is used to store data, normally about you when you're browsing. Now, sometimes it could be a bit of code, but generally they're small text files. They're normally sent by a web server to a browser on a user's computer, and each cookie is effectively a small table containing pairs of data. So it's a key, for example, surname, and then the actual data, which could be your surname. Now, every time you visit that website or a user visits a website, it checks if it has cookies already stored by the browser. And if it has those cookies, it will load it up. That speeds up the process of getting information from the user. It also allows you to continue the previous browsing activity. So for example, if you're looking at some products, those products will still be available in your shopping basket or your history. And cookies allow user tracking, and they also allow maintenance of user preferences. For example, if you chose a particular layout of a web page or a website, it will remember that. So it allows customization of a web page for each individual user. Now, because cookies can store information, they can also be used for things like targeted advertising or user tracking across multiple websites. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your point of view. For example, a company could look at what websites you're visiting and then it could alter its information for you to perhaps influence you to buy something. Of course, there are other ways you could manipulate users with cookies and their information. So there are privacy and security issues related to them. That's why the European Union has issued guidelines to protect companies in their storage of cookies. Now, generally, there are two types of cookies, a session cookie and a persistent or a permanent cookie. If a cookie doesn't have something called an expiry date associated with it, it's always considered to be a session cookie. So it should be deleted every time you close your browser or perhaps disconnect from a website. Now on screen, you will see a table with the differences between session cookies and persistent cookies. I suggest pause the video and jot some of these things down, or at least review them. So session cookies are stored in the browser's memory only, whereas persistent cookies obviously need to be stored on a hard disk drive if they're to be permanent. Session cookies do not have any expiration date, whereas persistent cookies have expiration dates. Try to make sure you know at least a use of session cookies and persistent cookies and a couple of differences between them. So how does the process of using cookies actually work? Now on screen, you will see a diagram that outlines this particular process. The first time the user logs in, the web browser requests the web page from the website. The website sends it to the web browser, which then translates it. It then sends a cookie back to the user's browser, and that cookie could either be a session cookie or a persistent cookie. If it's a session cookie, it's stored in temporary memory. If it's a persistent cookie, it's stored on the hard drive. The web browser is then closed with all the information. The session cookie is obviously deleted from memory. The persistent cookie remains stored. The next time the user logs in, the same process occurs. The web browser will connect to the website. The web server checks and identifies any particular persistent cookies stored on the user's computer. And if they are stored, it requests those cookies. And based on that, it tailors the website and the HTML and the CSS, and then it sends an updated web page back to the browser, which then translates and displays it. Remember, session cookies are sent from the web server to the user's browser, right? The browser doesn't create them on their own. And the same rule applies to persistent cookies as well. The web server sends cookies to the user's browser and then they're stored. So let's look at session cookies in a bit more depth. Session cookies are used, for example, when we make online purchases. They keep a user's items in a virtual shopping basket. It's stored in temporary memory, doesn't collect any information from the user's computer, doesn't personally identify users, so they're pretty safe. Hence, session cookies cease to exist once the browser is closed or the website session is terminated. That's a key difference in using session cookies. Persistent cookies, on the other hand, might remember a user's login details. They're generally stored on the hard drive until the expiry date is reached or the user deletes it. These cookies remain in operation even after the browser is closed. They remove the need to type in login details every time a website is visited. However, this can only be done if the user has provided the website with certain personal information and agrees to it being stored. So permission has to be asked for by the website before they create persistent cookies. We're just talking about login details. It's not just login details, it could be user preferences, your history, all sorts of other things as part of persistent cookies. So just be aware, this is just an example, not the only thing persistent cookies store. Now, genuine websites will always encrypt any personal information to prevent unauthorized use by a third party. And many countries, including the EU and the UK, have introduced laws to protect users. And these cookies are supposed to become deactivated after 6 months, even if they have an expiry date. However, depending on which country the website or the web server is located, their rules might be a bit different. So just be aware and be cautious in the use of persistent cookies. Now, persistent cookies aren't all bad. They're a very efficient way of carrying data from one website session to another, or even between sessions on related websites. They remove the need to store massive amounts of data on the web server itself. That speeds up how transactions occur. Without them, it will be very difficult to retrieve a user's data, and they will need to log in every single time and enter details all over again every time you connect to a website. So they're very convenient as well. However, there are inherent security and privacy risks associated with these. So if they're not encrypted, your personal information can be at risk. And of course, the tracking element can invade your privacy quite significantly. So if you ever wondered how Instagram knows that you were thinking about buying a pair of shoes or going on holiday, that's because there might be some element of cookie tracking being involved there. Now on screen is a summary of the uses of persistent cookies. Make sure you remember a few of these. They allow the website to remember users' passwords, email addresses, invoice details, so you don't have to insert all of this information every time a website is visited or every time you try to buy something. They serve as a kind of memory, enabling the website to recognize users every time they visit them. They allow the saving of user items in a virtual shopping basket, the storage of user preferences, tracking of internet habits, histories, bookmarks. They allow targeted advertising to occur. So based on your previous purchases or surfing habits, you'll be recommended certain products. They're used in online financial transactions. They allow progress in online games and quizzes to be stored. They allow social networking sites to recognize preferences and browsing histories. And they also allow different languages to be used on the web pages automatically. So quite useful, really. Some websites will probably break if we delete persistent cookies and they just won't work properly. Okay, that's all for today's session. Hopefully you can answer the following questions. What is meant by a cookie? So the first one obviously is going to be something to do with a text file and then something else. So if you're not sure what it is, rewind the video and maybe have a look at that particular session. Give two differences between session cookies and persistent cookies. List three uses of persistent cookies. Describe the use of session cookie. How are cookies used by a browser? That particular process needs to be outlined. So please make sure you can answer these questions before you continue on to the next video. That's all for today. If you have any questions or you find something difficult, as usual, pop a note in the comments and I'll get back to you.